The heavy iron bolt of my motel room door was the only thing standing between me and the pitch-black emptiness of Highway 99, a road that seemed to swallow headlights and hope in equal measure. It was nearly 2 in the morning, and the neon sign of the desert rose and flickered with a rhythmic hum that vibrated through the thin, stained carpet under my feet. I was hundreds of miles from anyone who knew my name, tucked into a room that smelled of industrial bleach and old cigarettes, trying to convince myself that the shadows moving across the curtains were just the wind. Then, the sound came, 3 distinct, polite, and terrifyingly human knocks against the hollow wood of the door. My heart didn't just race. It hammered against my ribs with a force that made it hard to draw a full breath. I froze where I sat on the edge of the unmade bed, my fingers gripping the rough fabric of the duvet until my knuckles turned white. Who could possibly be knocking at this hour in a place where the nearest gas station was 20 miles of desert road away? I stared at the door, watching the way the light from the parking lot bled through the gaps in the frame, waiting for a voice or a second sign of life. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, lasting long enough for me to wonder if I had imagined the sound entirely. Just as I began to exhale, the knocking started again, softer this time, accompanied by a muffled, feminine voice that sounded like it was trembling with cold. "Please, is someone in there? I'm so sorry to bother you, but my car broke down a mile back and my phone is completely dead. I just need to call for a tow. Please, it's freezing out here." Her voice was the perfect bait, vulnerable, high-pitched, and laced with the kind of desperation that triggers an immediate instinct to help. I stood up slowly, my feet silent on the carpet, and moved toward the door while my mind flooded with a dozen different questions. Why hadn't she gone to the front office, which was clearly marked with a glowing open sign near the entrance of the lot? How had she walked a mile in the pitch black without a flashlight? And why didn't I hear any footsteps approaching my specific room before the knocking began? I reached the door but didn't touch the handle. Instead, I leaned in toward the tiny, distorted glass of the peephole. Outside, a woman stood under the yellow glow of the porch light, her hair disheveled and her thin cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders. She looked exactly like someone in distress, her eyes darting nervously toward the dark parking lot behind her. "I can't open the door," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and foreign to my own ears. "But I can call the police or a tow truck for you from the room phone." The moment the words left my mouth, her expression shifted, not into relief, but into a sharp, focused intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "The office is locked and the payphone is broken," she said, her voice losing some of its tremor and becoming more demanding. "I just need to step inside for a second to get warm while you make the call. Please, I saw your light on. I know you're awake." It was the "I know you're awake" that did it. It wasn't a plea anymore. It was a statement of observation. I stayed silent, my eyes still pressed to the peephole, and that was when I noticed the small, almost imperceptible detail that saved my life. As she turned her head to look back at the darkness, the light caught a reflection in the side mirror of a black SUV parked 2 stalls down from my room. In that reflection, I didn't see an empty car. I saw the silhouette of a large man crouched low beside the rear tire, holding something long and heavy in his right hand. My blood turned to ice as the realization hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't a victim. She was the lure, the good Samaritan designed to make me undo the locks and give them the opening they needed. If I turned that handle, I wouldn't be helping a woman in need. I would be inviting a predator into a confined space where no one would hear me scream over the sound of the highway wind. "I'm calling the police now," I said, my voice louder and firmer this time. "They'll be here in 10 minutes to help you." The woman's demeanor changed instantly, the mask of the helpless traveler falling away to reveal a cold, hard anger. She didn't respond with a thank you. She simply stared at the door for 3 long seconds before tapping her knuckles against the wood one last time. Not a knock for help, but a signal. Through the peephole, I watched the man by the SUV stand up and begin walking toward my door with a purposeful, heavy gait. Panic surged through me, a primal fight or flight response that had nowhere to go in the small motel room. I backed away from the door, grabbing the heavy metal desk chair and wedging it under the handle with trembling hands. The man reached the door and didn't knock. He simply leaned his weight against it, testing the strength of the frame. I could hear his heavy breathing through the wood, a low, rhythmic sound that made the room feel like a cage. "Open the door, friend," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone that lacked any of the woman's feigned kindness. "We just want the keys to the car out front and whatever cash you're carrying. Don't make this a long night for yourself." I didn't answer. I ran to the bathroom, locking the second door behind me and scrambling for my own phone on the nightstand. My hands were shaking so violently that I nearly dropped it, but I managed to dial the emergency digits, whispering my location to the operator while I watched the main door shake under the pressure of a shoulder strike. The sound of the wood splintering was the most terrifying noise I had ever heard, a sharp, cracking protest that echoed in the small space. I moved to the window, but it was a fixed pane of thick glass that didn't open, leaving me trapped in the bathroom as the sounds of the break-in grew louder. Every second felt like an hour as I listened to the man and woman whispering on the other side of the door, their shadows dancing in the gap at the bottom. They were trying to pry the door open, using some kind of tool to bypass the deadbolt I had so foolishly trusted. "The cops are on the way," I screamed, hoping the lie would be enough to scare them off, even though I knew the nearest patrol car could be miles away. "They tracked the call. They're turning into the lot right now." The pressure on the door stopped abruptly. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the neon sign and the blood rushing in my ears. I held my breath, praying that the threat of authority was enough to outweigh the prize they thought was inside. Then, I heard the sound of footsteps retreating, fast, heavy thuds against the pavement, followed by the roar of an engine coming to life. I stayed huddled on the bathroom floor for what felt like an eternity, my eyes fixed on the door handle, waiting for it to turn again. It wasn't until the blue and red lights of a real police cruiser began to strobe against the curtains that I finally allowed myself to let go of the chair. When I finally stepped outside to talk to the officer, I saw the deep gouges in the door frame where they had tried to crowbar their way in. The broken-down car was nowhere to be seen, and the highway was as empty and silent as a grave. I didn't stay to finish my night of sleep. I packed my bags, handed the keys to the terrified night clerk, and drove until the sun came up, never once looking in my rearview mirror. I learned that night that the most dangerous thing in the dark isn't the silence. It's the voice that asks you to open the door. The neighborhood was one of those old, quiet suburbs where the streetlights hummed with a low, buzzing sound that always made me feel like I was being watched. I had just moved into the small, craftsman-style house on the corner, a place that needed a lot of work but felt like a fresh start after a messy divorce. The previous tenant had left in a hurry, leaving behind piles of junk and a heavy, lingering sense of unease that I tried to ignore as I unpacked my boxes late into the night. It was exactly 12:45 a.m. when the first knock vibrated through the floorboards, a sound so heavy and rhythmic that it didn't feel like a hand. It felt like a warning. I dropped the roll of packing tape, the sharp rip of the plastic echoing in the empty living room as I stared toward the front hallway. My shadow stretched long and thin against the peeling wallpaper, and for a moment, I stood perfectly still, listening to the silence of the house. Then, the knocking came again, but this time it wasn't just a knock. It was a series of violent, rapid-fire blows that made the decorative glass in the door rattle in its frame. I approached the hallway slowly, my heart thumping a frantic beat against my ribs, wondering who on earth would be looking for me at this hour when I hadn't even updated my address on my driver's license yet. I didn't turn on the porch light. Instead, I crept toward the door and looked through the small, circular peephole. Outside, 3 men stood on my porch, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hooded sweatshirts and the way they leaned aggressively toward the wood. They weren't wearing masks, but they looked like they didn't care if I saw them, which was a far more terrifying thought. "We know you're in there, Miller," one of them shouted, his voice a jagged edge of anger that cut through the night air. "Open the door and give us what's ours, or we're coming in to get it ourselves." My breath hitched in my throat as I realized they were calling for someone who wasn't me. "You have the wrong house," I yelled back, my voice cracking with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "There is no Miller here. I just moved in 3 days ago. I don't know who you're talking about." I waited for them to realize their mistake, to apologize and walk away into the darkness. But the response I got was a loud, mocking laugh that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Nice try, Miller," the man replied, and I heard the metallic click of something heavy being adjusted in his hand. "We followed the truck. We saw you bringing the boxes in. You think you can just disappear with 20 grand of our product and hide in a fixer-upper? We're done talking." The gravity of the situation hit me like a physical weight. These men weren't looking for a person. They were looking for something the previous tenant had hidden, and they were convinced I was the thief. I backed away from the door, my mind racing through every possible scenario. I hadn't found any product or money while cleaning, but these men weren't going to believe a stranger's word over their own eyes. I heard a heavy thud against the door, then another, as they began to use their collective weight to try and burst the hinges. The old wood groaned and splintered, and I knew the deadbolt wouldn't hold for more than a minute against that kind of brute force. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing a heavy chef's knife from the counter more out of instinct than a plan. My phone was charging in the bedroom, a distance that felt like a mile in the dark, cramped hallway. I could hear them talking outside, their voices low and urgent, discussing which window would be the easiest to smash if the door didn't give way. "Check the back," one of them hissed, and I heard the sound of heavy boots crunching on the gravel path that led toward my kitchen door. I was trapped between 2 points of entry, my heart racing so fast I felt dizzy. I realized then that if I stayed in the house, I was a sitting duck. I needed to create a distraction or find a way to prove I wasn't who they thought I was. As the person at the back door began to kick at the thin wooden panels, I noticed an old, heavy floor vent in the kitchen that I had struggled to open earlier that day while cleaning. I dropped to my knees, prying at the metal grate with the knife until it popped loose with a loud, metallic clang. Beneath it wasn't just a duct. It was a small, hidden compartment built into the subfloor, likely used for valuables by the previous owner. Inside sat a black, weatherproof bag that felt heavy and solid. My pulse spiked. This was what they were after. The previous tenant, Miller, had left his stash behind, and I was the one paying the price for his negligence. The back door's glass shattered, shards of it spraying across the linoleum floor like diamonds in the dark. I knew I had seconds. I didn't grab the bag to keep it. I grabbed it to survive. I stood up and ran back toward the front door, which was bowing inward under the pressure of the 2 men outside. "Wait!" I screamed, the desperation in my voice finally getting their attention. "I found it! I found Miller's bag. I'm throwing it out the window. Just take it and leave." The pounding stopped instantly. I moved to the side window, unlatching it and shoving the heavy black bag through the opening so it landed on the lawn with a dull thud. I watched through the blinds as the men scrambled toward it, their greed momentarily overriding their violence. They ripped the bag open right there on the grass, and I saw the reflection of plastic-wrapped bricks under the streetlights. They didn't look back at the house. They didn't care about me anymore. They piled into an idling car down the street and sped off, the tires screeching against the asphalt. I collapsed against the wall, the knife still clutched in my hand, as the silence returned to the neighborhood. I stayed there until the sun began to peek over the horizon, my eyes fixed on the broken glass of my kitchen door. I didn't call the police until I was sure they were miles away, and I spent the rest of the day packing my own boxes. I didn't care about the security deposit or the fresh start anymore. I just wanted to be somewhere where nobody knew the name Miller and where the only sound at midnight was the wind. I survived because I found what they wanted, but the thought of what would have happened if that floor vent had been empty still keeps me awake at night. The suburban silence was usually a comfort, a thick blanket that tucked the neighborhood in after 11 p.m. But tonight, the air inside my house felt thin, like the oxygen was being sucked out by the absolute stillness of the street outside. I was sitting in my living room, the only light coming from the blue glow of my laptop screen, when the first sound broke the quiet. It wasn't a knock, not at first. It was a slow, rhythmic dragging sensation against the wood of my back door, followed by a sharp, desperate scratching that made my skin crawl. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, staring at the shadows dancing on the kitchen tile. Then it came, a single heavy knock that echoed through the hallway like a heartbeat. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and moved toward the kitchen. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want anyone outside to know exactly where I was standing. As I reached the door, the scratching started again, more frantic this time, accompanied by a low, muffled whimpering. It sounded like a wounded animal, but there was a cadence to it that felt far more human. I leaned my head against the cold wood, my ear inches away from whatever was on the other side. "Help, please." The voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible over the sound of the wind stirring the trees in the yard. "They're coming. Please, just let me in for a second." My hand hovered over the deadbolt, my instinct to help fighting a war with the cold knot of dread in my stomach. "Who are you?" I whispered back, my voice trembling. "Who is coming?" There was no answer, only the sound of a heavy body slumping against the door, followed by a frantic 3-beat knock that sounded like a plea for a life. I looked through the small window above the sink, squinting into the darkness of my backyard. At first, I saw nothing but the outlines of the bushes and the fence. But then, a flash of light cut through the trees at the edge of my property. A flashlight beam, sweeping low across the grass. Then another one appeared from the opposite side, both moving toward my house with a terrifying, coordinated speed. The person outside my door began to pound now, their fists hitting the wood with a dull, meaty thud. "They're in the yard. Please. I didn't do anything. They just won't stop." The voice belonged to a young man, and the terror in it was so raw, so believable, that my fingers gripped the lock. But as I looked back out the window, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The 2 flashlights weren't searching for someone. They were moving in a straight line toward my back porch, and they weren't making a sound. No shouting, no heavy breathing, no snapping twigs. Just 2 silent hunters closing in on a target. I realized in that moment that if I opened this door, I wasn't just letting in a victim. I was opening my home to whatever was chasing him. Or worse, I was falling for a choreographed trap designed to make me undo my own security. The scratching on the door stopped abruptly, replaced by a sudden violent kick that made the frame groan. "Open the door now!" the voice screamed, the mask of the victim slipping away to reveal a jagged, predatory edge. I backed away, tripping over a kitchen chair as the back door began to shake under a series of coordinated strikes. The victim wasn't alone anymore. I could hear the heavy thud of multiple sets of boots stepping onto my wooden porch. They weren't whispering. They were working in a terrifying, professional silence. I scrambled into the hallway, my mind racing through my options. The front door was an option, but as I glanced through the living room window, I saw a dark sedan idling at the curb with its lights off. They had the house surrounded. I ran for the stairs, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I needed to get to the 2nd floor, to the one room that had a solid core door and a separate lock. As I reached the landing, I heard the sound of the back door finally giving way, the sickening crack of wood splintering and the heavy metallic ring of the deadbolt hitting the floor. They were inside. I ducked into my bedroom, slamming the door and twisting the lock just as I heard the first footsteps on the stairs. They weren't rushing. They were walking with a slow, deliberate pace that told me they knew I had nowhere left to run. I crawled under the bed, pressing my face against the cold floorboards, trying to keep my breathing silent even though my lungs felt like they were on fire. The footsteps reached the hallway outside my bedroom. I could see the shadows of their feet moving in the gap under the door. 3 pairs of dark boots. One of them stopped right in front of the handle. There was a long, agonizing silence where the only sound was the ticking of the clock on my nightstand. Then, a soft, polite knock. "We know you're in there," the gravelly voice said, the tone almost conversational. "We don't want you. We just want the kid who was standing on your porch." He ran around to your side window while we were busy with the door. Tell us where he went, and we'll leave your house exactly as we found it." My blood ran cold. The person who had been knocking and screaming for help hadn't been an accomplice. He had been a genuine victim, and while I was focused on the men at the door, he had tried to find another way in. Or had he? Was this another lie to get me to open the door? I stayed silent, refusing to give them a single sound to track. "Suit yourself," the voice said. I heard the sound of a heavy object hitting the door, a warning of what would happen if I didn't comply. But then, the sound of a distant siren began to wail, growing louder with every passing second. I had triggered my silent alarm when I ran upstairs, a feature of my security system I had almost forgotten in the fog of my panic. The shadows under the door shifted instantly. "Move," the voice hissed. I listened to the sound of the men retreating, their footsteps heavy and fast as they ran back down the stairs and out through the broken back door. I didn't move for 20 minutes, not until the red and blue lights were reflecting off my bedroom ceiling and a megaphone demanded to know if anyone was inside. When the police finally cleared the house, they found the back door hanging by a single hinge. But the most chilling discovery was at the side window of the living room. The screen had been cut clean away, and there were muddy handprints on the glass, as if someone had been trying to pull themselves inside while I was hiding upstairs. The police never found the men, and they never found the person who had been knocking for help. To this day, I don't know if I saved myself by keeping the door locked, or if I left someone to a terrible fate. All I know is that now, every time I hear a branch brush against the house or a floorboard creak at night, I find myself staring at the door, waiting for the scratching to start again. The silence of the suburbs isn't a blanket anymore. It's a shroud, and I never, ever answer the door after midnight.